Going back to Telefolmin, there have been things going on there as well. One of the most important is in the year 2000, the Spirit House at Telefolmin collapsed and was not rebuilt. It was instead left basically as rubble, as with wood and timber and bark lying around the place. The relics were disposed of or buried, one or the other. And at that point, there was something else going on, and there was a lot of talk, a lot of interest, certainly among people in church circles, about things going on in transnational Christianity. And one of them is that they were getting news via these channels of events going on elsewhere. Some things, it's hard to tell quite what the method of transmission was, but I heard concerns, for example, about barcodes, product codes that had come into use for electronic purchases in stores. So these kind of codes here, oops. Yeah. There was some concern about what they meant. Some thought they meant that there was the sign of the devil, or was the mark of the devil, and meant that one was going to be dominated by the devil. Other people were not sure. They thought maybe that when Jesus returned to Earth, that would provide you with the entry into the aircraft that would take you to heaven at the end of the world. There was a lot of apocalyptic thinking. It had an awful lot to do with war in the Middle East. The Gulf War in particular was getting a lot of interest, partly because of it overlaps with biblical sites. And there were these conspiracy theories going around. That did coincide with the collapse of the Spirit House at Telefolmin. What remained there after the house collapsed were those two vines that I mentioned, the taro vine and the man vine. Okay. And people decided that it was important to dig those out and see if there was anything there. They thought there might possibly be gold or minerals at the base of those vines, because after all, that's where the land of the dead, they had the minerals there. So they started digging, and they dug and they dug and they dug. They didn't find any minerals, but they found earth that was discolored and had a very, very strange smell. Through church circles, they contacted somebody to see if they could find out anything further about it. They said they would take it. It would be analyzed, possibly even sending it as far as Israel to be analyzed. The word came back that it was uranium gas. There was a source of uranium gas at the site that could be useful to Israel in its wars and its survival. And the second thing is that at least a couple of individuals had hair clippings taken, and they said these were sent to Israel for DNA analysis, which showed that they were members of the tribe of Benjamin. They were one of the lost tribes. So the idea was, among other things, the Telefolmin spirit house has disappeared, but it's seen as a link to a much larger world now of Christianity that involves them in world events. At least that's the idea. And that strain of thought has persisted off and on. It goes in waves and that kind of thing, but it reappears in church sermons and sometimes in people's speculations or in their reaction to news reports. And of course, since people have been going to Tabouville, either as visitors or residents, they're used to seeing television and reports from elsewhere and finding out much more about how the world works that way. That's been one of the things I've been speculating about. So having said that, there is a kind of issue that also arises with the distance between urban people and people in the villages. And one of them is, of course, there's a huge wealth disparity. And people who work at the mines are actually very, very good at that. They send remittances home. They're very good at sending money home to people. But of course, they only send them to their closer relatives. They don't put on a feast, for example, or anything of that kind. So it does tend to exaggerate inequalities in the village as well as between the village and the town. People who have relatives working in town can have access to some cash income. It's a bit harder for people who don't. And people who live in town, of course, live in dwellings that villagers would regard as palatial. They have running water, they have lights and electricity, they have televisions, they have a garage for motor vehicles, and some people have cars, and they can drive them down the highway, that kind of thing. And so it is a kind of opulent standard of living. It became a common practice for people to send to foster children to relatives in town, especially to go to the high school there. So you would have people living in town for a number of years and sometimes getting employment at the mine. But as that went on, the disparities disappeared. You also had problems with people who returned from employment at the mine and had to readjust to village life, and that didn't always go easily. One of the things that happened in the case of a good friend of mine who worked at the mine for a number of years, came back, and when he came back, he hoped to get married. And now that cash had become part of the picture and sister exchange was very difficult to manage now with people's relatives scattered all over the place, people insisted on bride price. They meant cash, they meant money. And bride price inflation became a very common feature in marriages, and people who tried to marry telephone women were being expected to pay very, very large bride prices because they knew there was a cash income there sometime. This particular fellow, and this has happened in other cases, went and searched for a potential spouse in a community outside of Telefolmin, off further away in the bush, where there was a bride price that he could imagine. This has also had a follow-on effect in some small villages and out-of-the-way places, where there's been a net outflow of women, of marriageable women from these small villages, and they face a kind of demographic crisis of their own as a result of that. So there are these sort of population shifts, very, very small scale, but taken all together, they are the kind of thing that affects everyday life. In the case of one man that I know who was working at the mine, he was married, but he went back to the mine to work to get a cash income to look after his wife and his mother, in order to save money and probably just to keep things together. His wife and his mother were to share a house back in the village in Telefolmin, where he lived. Problem is, his wife and his mother didn't get along. And what they didn't get along over was the division of the cash that he sent back for them. And there was constant quarreling. His wife was on the verge of seeking a divorce, and said to him, this will not work. You've got to do something. Either she goes or I go, or you've got to come back. He decided somewhat reluctantly to give up his job at the mine, come back to the village, and he did so. After he did so, he started having problems, and the problems had to do with he wasn't able to sleep very well, and he started seeing things. And one of the things that he started seeing was something that frightened him immensely, and it was a hand reaching up through the floor over towards him in the middle of the night, and then it would disappear. He finally came to the conclusion that must have been a friend of his who had died in childhood, who was trying to take him back to the land of the dead, which just coincidentally was underneath where the mine is, trying to take him back. He had fits of sleeplessness, very disturbed. He would sometimes break out in tears and that kind of thing for no apparent reason. And at one point, he said, look, my friend wants me to come back, which means he wants me to die. He wants me to go to the land of the dead. And people started watching him very closely. On more than one occasion, he dashed out into the bush with a bush knife in the middle of the night. In Telefolmin, everybody knows what that means. It means he wants to go hang himself, wanted to commit suicide. They watched him. They brought him back. They stopped him. And this was a time where a spirit Mary, one of these female spirit mediums, was called upon to help. And so she gathered together all of his relatives and himself and held a session where they all prayed together. They all joined hands. They all trembled together. She went into a bit of a seance and said that God wants you to stay here with your family, and you're going to go to heaven with your wife when it's time, and it's not time yet. You're going to be okay. And it was, among other things, I mean, it was very moving, but among other things, it went from a situation where I had always perceived spirit Marys as disruptive forces. Here she was actually acting as a healer, as a guardian, and that's been helpful. And it seems to be a kind of role that they're called upon more and more often to help calm things down, even things out. So that's an important change, which for me at least wasn't foreseeable in advance. So that was an important kind of thing. I think after that, what I want to say is that the issue, nonetheless, of inequalities between mining people and villagers has remained. It became more pronounced. The kinds of dances that used to take place between villages don't happen any longer. There used to be a way in which one village would go and dance. They would say, we're dancing for this village. We're going to entertain them. And then they'll have a meal and they'll go back and then they'll swap back and forth. Those days are gone. Instead, what happens is the reunion, and that's where people renewed friendships and acquaintances. The reunion is between people living in town and people living in the bush. And people living in the bush don't go to town as people living in town come back to the bush. Okay. When they come back, they're expected to bring gifts with them. If they don't, it's commented on. People notice and that kind of thing. So there's a great deal of pressure in these situations as well, and they sometimes get fraught. This, I think, becomes important when we begin to try to consider what the situation is as we move towards what some people have called dark anthropology, or the anthropology of dark times. So on the surface, it's a situation where you had prosperity, you had people getting along pretty well, they had better contact in all kinds of ways, yet there was some unhappiness around the place. And round about 2011 or so, things took a turn for the worse. I should point out just before that, and I think it is possibly relevant, just before that is when the cell phone tower network was put in and when mobile phones became fairly common in rural Papua New Guinea. So phones were common. And I had actually gone back to Telefolmin to study the connections, the movement from place to place, connections between them, and also the role of phones in that. And I contacted a friend of mine who was living in another urban center, and I said, I'm planning to come back soon. How are things? He said, well, the last Christmas, things were not very good. Some bad things were going on. To go to what is the tip of a very large iceberg with a very sad story is somebody had died on their way back to the village en route from an employment site. And other people decided that that person was killed by sorcery, was killed by witchcraft. And they were going to deal with the situation. And they accused people of being witches. And over the course of several days, sometimes into weeks, they began to terrorize their village as people started coming back. And how would they do this? One of the things they would do is, the accusers here were all young men, village men, would take their tools, take their bush knives, their machetes, and their axes, and walk along the government road, and where there were stones along the road, they'd swing them so sparks would fly in the night and say they were getting ready for an operation. They were getting ready for an operation. They were getting ready for an operation. They would take people who were accused. They would publicly beat them. They would insist that their fellow villagers witness the beating. Sometimes the beating was all that took place. Sometimes it amounted to torture. And in a couple of cases, it amounted to murder in front of their family. A good friend of mine, somebody I knew as a young woman, her son was accused of witchcraft by these guys, and he was being cut, and she held him to protect him. They killed him nonetheless, and both of her forearms were shattered by the blows. It was hell on earth. And that's what Telefolmin called witchcraft. I wrote about this stuff partly because I think it's really important that people know that this happens. I also wrote about this stuff because throughout Papua New Guinea, reports of similar kinds of things were going on elsewhere, were happening elsewhere. So it wasn't isolated. It wasn't just in this place. In many other places, the victims of the accusations were women. In the Telefolmin case, they were men. It was the men who were attacked. The attackers in Telefolmin called themselves the boys. Okay, and the boys were said by fellow villagers. They built themselves a kind of camp and a house on margins of the village. They called it their men's house. The boys were, as far as the villagers were concerned, were called useless. And what they meant by useless is they hadn't completed any education. They didn't have any employment. They were nothing. What they had done by way of getting access to income, as far as one could tell, is that there was an underground and illegal long-distance trade that followed the route up the Fly River, through Tabubil, up into the Telefolmin area, and then east into the highlands. And what went along that route is going south along the route was marijuana, headed for the Australian drug trade. What came in the other direction were firearms and weapons. In addition, there was some illegal gold panning going on near the Opteti mine site. There was also a gold trade going on. So in the discussions of how they operated, the boys would, before they decided on targets, they would smoke a lot of marijuana and dream, and these dreams would give them visions as to who the guilty parties were. And those were the ones that they decided on that they would attack, and so on. There was a range of attacks. Some of the people were young people. There were also middle-aged men, including my best friend Dagasim was attacked. He was left bleeding on the ground. Fortunately, they left him alive. And that was perhaps true in other people's cases. But what it did to the village and to their relatives was just horrendous, just impossible. Eventually, but only eventually, the police intervened. They did not do so initially. There were various explanations given. There were some elections coming up, and they didn't have the manpower to spare to send them down to the villages. They weren't sure that it might not have made things any better, could have made things worse, that sort of thing. There was some fear that there were firearms around, and so on. But it was a horrible period. Did not happen, thank heavens, when I was there, although who knows. But the dust had begun to settle on that. There had been an election shortly afterwards, and one of the most promising parts of the election is the new member of parliament ordered that a new lockup for prisoners be built at the government station. One of the problems that the police at the station said is we didn't have any place to keep these people if we arrested them. So there were trials held. I won't venture too many opinions about the trials, except to say they did not produce satisfactory results. But things did tend to quiet down after a while, and that seems to have subsided. The point that I think is worth carrying away for this, both for anthropologists in particular, but for the public in general, is this is absolutely not a continuation of traditional practices or beliefs. There's nothing at all traditional about this so-called witchcraft. The word in telephone is witchcraft. They take it as something that they got from us, that was imported from by white people, and it entered in the area. It's regarded as something that's alien, and they had to practice to figure out how to make it work, how to do all the divination and so on. But it's anything but a continuation of traditional culture in a new context. It instead is something rather vicious that grows, I would argue, and I've written a little bit about this someplace, not always persuading my colleagues, although I have some who follow this quite closely in their own areas, it seems to match, is the lines of transmission tend to follow two kinds of lines. One of them is the expanding road system in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, and the other is the expanding mobile phone network, telephone network, especially after the introduction of data where you can get videos and that kind of thing. So one of the ways that, for instance, we know about one of the most awful cases of killing of a woman accused of witchcraft in the Highlands, east of Telefolmin, was that somebody was there with a telephone and they did a video of the whole thing and put it on the internet so that people could see her being killed. This is very scary stuff. In terms of things that I was already interested in, it shows a reason to be interested in connectivity and in these stretched relationships. One of the things I would say, not so much on behalf of the boys, but just simply to point out, is that in a situation where lots of other people found themselves being winners, they were the losers. They had nothing to show for any of the things that had happened. Everybody else seemed to be making out okay. They were getting nothing except what they could do for their guns for marijuana trade. So that's about all, but that's about as dark as anthropology can get, as the kinds of things can get. There are more examples later that I'll talk to in the work of colleagues from elsewhere. But it's important to say that this was part of the picture, and probably for me the darkest moment, or one of the darkest moments that I can think of, certainly in my time, but also in the memory of anybody living there.